Yes,
Do you have enough handouts?
we do. Yes.
Okay.
For poetry.
Yay.
Yay. Yeah, we pulled it. But their crowd is still coming. Okay. Welcome. I'm still a little out of breath from moving the chairs. It's great to see this many people here for poetry. Before we get started, I do want to mention that the Escalette collection and the creative writing programs are doing a contest. So if you are a student writer here at Chapman and you are interested in this, hop over to me, or I can put this on the table with the food so that you can scan the QR code and find out about this contest, which has nothing to do with today's event, but I know there are a lot of writers in the room. All right. I have notes because this is a joint effort between Engaging the World, which is a program sponsored by Wilkinson College, and Tabula Poetica. So I'm gonna be less spontaneous and read from the page. Thank you for joining us today for Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences signature initiative, Engaging the World, Leading the Conversation. Each year, the college selects a key social issue to examine through interdisciplinary, campus-wide conversations intended to promote thoughtful dialogue, mindful reflection, social tolerance, awareness and respect, peace and kindness. Wilkinson is partnering this year with Queen College of Health and Behavioral Sciences for the 23-24 series, which focuses on health equity. Hence today's connection. So through this Engaging the World program this fall, we have heard and will hear from journalists, healthcare providers, activists, scholars, poets, artists, and filmmakers who are fighting for health equity. They will lead and have already led conversation across the campus to help us understand how historical, cultural, social, and economic disparities impact access to health and healthcare, and what can be done to ensure that everyone can attain the highest level of healthcare, regardless of their disease, gender, race, nationality, or ethnicity. We encourage students interested in exploring these issues past the semester, past these great events, to take a look at the Health Humanities minor that's now housed in Wilkinson College. The next event in the Engaging the World series is a panel on trans health and wellness, which will be taking place upstairs in the Cross-Cultural Center here in this building, our Juris Forum, on Thursday, November 9th, 2 days from now at 2:30. Today's event is also part of the Tabula Poetica series that Dr. Logan Esdale, who's sitting here in the front row, and I piloted in 2009, which makes this the 15th iteration of Tabula Poetica. Yay! When I did the counting on my fingers, it made me feel really old that I had done anything for 15 years. This series concludes with the MFA poetry reading on Tuesday, December 12th at 4 p.m. right here in our Juris Forum 209B, I believe. And that's always a great celebration of poetry and our graduate program, and it's a good break during finals, and usually that is the final exam for some of our poets. We'd like to extend special thanks to Karen Wilkinson and Reg Lancaster for their support of Engaging the World. Karen is the daughter of Harmon Wilkinson, the namesake of Wilkinson College. Other sponsors for today's event include the English Department and Poets and writers. In the English department, thanks especially to Dr. Linda Hall, our department chair, and to Julia Ainley, who is here in the first row. She's the English department admin who handles all the logistics for this series. She quickly adapted today's event because we had planned to have Suzanne Edison here in person, but as you can see, she is on the screen because she was unable to travel to campus as we had planned. She will also be here on screen at 4 p.m. if you want to come back for more poetry and especially hearing some of her own poems. Whenever you enjoy a literary event, whether it's one here at Chapman University or somewhere else, I encourage you to read the author's latest book and any other books the author has published. This is Suzanne Edison's latest book. We were able to provide this for 4 classes this fall. That's the first time we've ever had the opportunity to do that. So I hope we can continue that, but I'm not sure exactly how. Take a moment right now to silence your cell phone so that we don't get interrupted. Something I have to do as soon as I step away. I'm actually going to turn over the podium to Anthony Allegretti, who is one of our amazing graduate student poets.
Oh, well, hello, everybody. I am incredibly excited to welcome you all to today's poetry talk with Suzanne Edison, brought to you all by the Tabula Poetica reading series. But like poetry to many poets, including myself, has always been the mode in which we are able to navigate. A self-created map of sorts in the midst of a chaotic world. While that may be our underlying goal of like poetry, it is not as easy done as it is said. Language and metaphor can be powerful tools to communicate facets of health, illness, and like disability in ways that they are able to encapsulate experience that are more true to the feelings themselves. Our guest speaker today, Suzanne Edison, is a poet, therapist, and essayist whose body of work, including 4 poetry collections, has showcased this concept. From poems in her newest collection, Since the House is Burning, such as Coronavirus Seattle 2020, which works through the state of the pandemic, using Rembrandt's painting, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, as a rhetorical frame, to poems such as Breathing, that lean towards the more personal distraught of dealing with a loved one's diagnosis. Edison uses her own experiences as a therapist, a poet, and an educator to help translate a scientific world into one full of poetics. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome up to the screen, I guess, Suzanne Edison.
Thank you, Anthony. That was wonderful. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Anna. I am so disappointed not to be there in person. COVID caught me, and I am thrilled that I have the opportunity to at least be there virtually, which I know everybody is probably pretty sick of. But here we are, and I guess thankfully that this exists, thanks to our COVID world even. So that's an irony I will not forget. So today I'm going to talk about various aspects of writing about health equity and how to engage in a wider perspective on health-related topics. We're going to look at biases in healthcare. I'm going to talk about research, both doing research as a poet writer and also being a research subject, interviewing, who gets to tell the story, who gets to tell the experience, so whose point of view. I'm going to talk a little bit about pain and subjectivity, grief and loss. I'm going to look at how to incorporate medical language and facts and descriptions along with image and imagination. I'll read a little of my work and some of others. I'll give you a writing prompt in the beginning, and then we'll continue that at the end, and then you'll have something to take home with you. And you should all have a packet of some of the pieces that I'm going to talk about today, and in addition to a wider range of poems. I'm only going to probably read about 4 of the ones that are in your packet, but I wanted to make sure that you had a variety of things to look at in terms of these subject matters. I'm sure there's lots and lots, and Anna can give you more as well. And at the end, I'm going to leave some time for Q&A. So I wanted to just give you a tiny bit more background. When I started writing about my journey as a caregiver to my then 6-year-old daughter, I had not studied the topic of writing about healthcare or illness or anything, or myriad writers on this topic. I merely needed to write in order to stay sane. I had been writing poetry, but my work completely shifted when this diagnosis came down. And that was to try to hold the enormity of what I was experiencing on all fronts. So emotionally, I was overwhelmed, I was scared, confused, anxious. I had physical realities of pain in my belly, inability to sleep or eat well, anxiety. And then there's the sense of this spiritual confrontation. What or who would help me through this? What belief systems did I believe in anymore? And those were challenged. Eventually, I moved on to talking to other caregivers and patients, providing opportunities for them to write about their experiences. I started a support group at Seattle Children's Hospital for caregivers who were caring for anyone with a chronic illness. And then I went into researching various illnesses and interviewing caregivers and doctors and patients and giving them voice. Eventually, I went to grad school for an MFA with a focus on writing about the medical experience and more teaching and writing. And I've worked a lot with teenagers also who have chronic illness and helping to give them voice. And I'm going to show you some of the covers of those books later. But here's your opening writing prompt. So I hope you have something that you can write with. And it should be in your packet as well. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Take a moment. Does anyone not have it? Just raise your hand if you do not have it, access to it. Okay. Okay. Take a moment to write down the word illness or disease, and then make a list. So think about columns, perhaps. And I want you to make a list of images, facts, your own sensory awarenesses, taste, smell, touch, hearing, sight, and thoughts that come to you. And you can write about something that you live with or about someone whom you care about or have cared for. Additionally, take some time to compare the illness or the disease to color, texture, shape, plants or other elements of nature, animals, non-human machines or inventions. And if there are any specific words or descriptions that you want to make sure that you remember, go ahead and write that down. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to work on this. And I'm starting my little timer. In place of illness or disease, you can just put difference. Differently abled. And take about another minute. And go ahead and find a stopping point. We'll come back to it at near the end of this session. So I had spent a year trying to find a diagnosis for my daughter when she was ill. I thought she might die. We had no idea what was going on. As she got weaker and weaker, she couldn't get up off the floor without pushing herself up. She couldn't tie her shoes. She couldn't walk upstairs without pulling herself up on the banister. She had weird rashes on her face and her hands. She couldn't wear certain kinds of clothing. It itched her skin. When we finally got the diagnosis, after a year and a half, I was relieved, but I had no idea what I would face after that. So I began to do, of course, a lot of research. And so I'm asking the questions as a poet. How do we incorporate facts into our work as poets and writers? How do we engage metaphor, image, senses? What else besides our body minds do we have to draw from when illness comes to us or those we care about? Finally, how do our cultural, ethnic, religious, socioeconomic, and personal biases affect our work? And do we acknowledge them or not? Does every poem need this acknowledgement? Those are some of the questions I live with. The underlying premise for me about illness is that it is disordering, and caretaking can also involve a dissolution of parts of yourself. The poem then becomes a container for both the disorder and the reordering, but they are not always held together in one poem. I've given you some quotes by writers whom I have read a lot about illness and healing: Susan Sontag, Virginia Woolf, Anatole Broyard, and Gregory Orr. I'm not going to read all of those. I will read Gregory Orr's because I use his book, Poetry as Survival, quite a lot. I come back to it over and over. He says, and this is in your packet, in the personal lyric, turning life into language is what he means about the personal lyric. The self encounters its existential crisis in symbolic form, and the poem that results is a model of this encounter, a dramatized, expressive model of its crisis, acknowledging the existence, nature, and power of what is destabilizing it, while at the same time asserting its ultimate mastery over the disordering by the power of its linguistic and imaginative orderings. So first, I'm going to turn to your packet. We're going to talk a little bit about bias in medicine. And I'm going to read the poem, The Chart by Rafael Campo. I want you to just notice anything about facts, images, sensations, anything else. There's a lot about craft in here, but I'm not going to talk a lot about all of that. There's too much to go into. The chart. Rafael Campo is a doctor as well as a poet. He teaches at Harvard Medical School. He works in Boston. He was a mentor of mine. He uses poetry in his work with medical students as well as his patients. The chart says 54-year-old obese Hispanic female. I wonder if they mean the one with long black braids. Peruvian, who sells tamales at the farmer's market, tells me I'm too thin. I better eat. Or is she the Dominican with too much rouge and almond eyes at the dry cleaners who must have been so beautiful in her youth? Or maybe she's the Cuban lady, drunk on grief, who I've seen half asleep, alone as if that bench were only hers, the park her home at last. Or else the Mexican who hoards the littered papers she collects and says they are her documents. If not, it could be that Colombian drug addict whose Spanish, even when she's high, is perfect. Or maybe it's the one who never says exactly where she's from, but who reminds me of my grandmother, poor but refined, lace handkerchief balled up in her plump hand, who died too young from a condition that some doctor knows in her chart overlooked. So I think we can see in that poem how he's really trying to come to terms with a kind of bias that medical providers have, particularly when they're writing about their patients. And I think that that's a crucial one. I'm going to read from my book for a moment, and I'm going to share that poem on the screen since you don't really have it in front of you. This is the book it's from. It's called The Body Lives Its Undoing. It was a research project that I did in collaboration with a research institute on autoimmune diseases. And I interviewed patients and doctors and researchers and caregivers and wrote a series of poems. And the one that I want to share with you right now is called The Research Subject. So, cradled in sanitized air, tethered to a pole and a bag that's dripping an elixir in rhythmic blips, dreaming of side effects this drug might elicit: fever, flush of skin, risk of infection, rejection, a love for what's unknown, like the stranger I bump in a crowd, then meet again at a party. I bite and lick my lips as my blood, faith, and stamina are tested. Tested, I am subject and predicate. I am numbers on paper, reported and repurposed. Female, color me a bleached moon snail shell lying on a graveyard of bad blood, that husks of black Tuskegee men with syphilis tricked into sacrificing their lives. Given no diagnosis, no treatment. And Henrietta Lacks, immortalized by her raging cancer cells, taken and sold for profit without her knowledge. I know my rights. I can read. No one can touch me unless I agree. Agreeing, I am consented. Consensual, my body is shadowboxing. It agrees to disagree with itself. Not like lovers after a quarrel, more than apologies are needed. Oh, no, not going. Sorry. I want a sign, a change, my name on the consent forms. Want to be the magma and rock of possibility. Yes, if not healed, at least to be useful. Useful, used and schooled to ask questions. I have this itching to know what's infusing my veins. Is it the breakthrough spinning a spider's armature or a placebo a dud, a slug's slime trail, but I must be blind, double blind. Trials are trails doctors dream up, explorers slicing through colorless jungles of data. I follow in hues of dusk, striated gold, scrimping through evergreens outside the hospital window, and infusion drops caught in dilutions of light, shapeshift, fade to gray like a lover's face after the affair. I'm flushed and weary with hope, like a salmon returning to spawn, and my blood, summoned back to the heart, sluices on, seeking its reunion with air. Let's turn to the next poem in your packet. This one's called What You Mourn by Sheila Black. And as you can see, it's from her book, House of Bone, but it's also collected in Beauty is a Verb, which is a wonderful anthology of writings, essays, poems by those differently abled. And the reason I'm giving you this poem is I think it's again in the voice of the person themselves talking about kind of what was happening to them as a patient and their own reality. What you mourn. The year they straightened my legs, the young doctor said, meaning to be kind. Now you will walk straight on your wedding day. But what he could not imagine is how even on my wedding day, I would arch my back and wonder about the body I had before I was changed, how I would have nested in it, made it my home, how I repeated his words when I wished to stir up my native anger, feel like the exile I believed I was, imprisoned in a foreign body, like a person imprisoned in a foreign land, forced to speak a strange tongue, heavy in the mouth, a mouth full of stones. Crippled, they called us when I was young. Later, the word was disabled and then differently abled. But those were all names given by outsiders, none of whom could imagine that the crooked body they spoke of, the body which made walking difficult and running impossible, except as a kind of dance, a sideways looping like someone about to fall, headlong down and hug the earth. That body they tried so hard to fix, straighten, was simply mine. And I loved it as you love your own country, the familiar lay of the land, the unkempt trees, the smell of mowed grass, down to the nameless flowers at your feet, clover, asphodel, and the blue flies that buzz over them. So I'm probably giving you more than you would want in 1 hour, and I apologize if I'm overloading. I trust that you will take in what you need and let go of what doesn't work for you at the moment, and you can always come back to your packet later on. I'd like to talk a little bit more about cultural differences and biases, and also about researching disease. I want to look at 2 different approaches to a disease. That's sickle cell. Many years ago, I interviewed a West African mother of a sickle cell child who was now being seen in Seattle. She and her husband had come from West Africa because he was doing an epidemiology fellowship at the University of Washington, but they had a child with sickle cell. And she'd had a very different experience in Africa. I didn't know a lot about sickle cell at the time. It ended up that I worked a lot with kids with sickle cell at one of my writing workshops. So I decided to research more about the disease and its history, and I wrote a couple of poems. This one that's in your packet, I wrote, and then there are a couple more in your packet that were written by teenagers with sickle cell themselves. The one I'm going to read to you is called The Ones Who Come and Go. And all the words in italics except for Ogabanjes are various West African tribal words for sickle cell disease or for the pain associated with it. And I'm not really going to read the first section because I think we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to start with hundreds of years babies died, sort of in the middle of the poem. Hundreds of years babies died. Hundreds of years families cried curse. Even now, an educated mother is scorned. The mother hears, "Nui du dui," her child wailing. Red blood cells curved as sickles, dying before the marrow makes new ones. The mother says, "My child needs blood, a transfusion. She is so sick." The demon steals sleep, steals dreams. Mother thinks her own life is the sacrifice. All night, wee wee, owie, mommy, owie, will not let her child go. And what this woman experienced coming to the United States was that she was not ostracized. She was cared for and given community. And she told me that she used to stand in front of the hospital and just bless it. And that was amazing because we don't always feel that way. We don't always realize, I think, how hard it can be in other parts of the world. The next poem by Leila Nidfan is called Sickle Cell, and I really love how much she's put into this poem. She uses a lot of imagery about her body and about her people that she lives with and friends who do or don't understand and the disease itself. And, you know, she comes at the end to, "It's an everlasting battle, and I will forever raise my voice, fighting this fear, screaming clear, sickle cell will never define me." I think that that is an anthem in a lot of kids' work these days. I'm not defined by my disease or my illness. As far as other diseases and healthcare disparities, I think this poem I'm going to read next is partly based on interviews that I did with parents, this time of kids with arthritis, and my rudimentary knowledge of trying to get healthcare to homeless people, to people living unhoused. For a while, I worked with a nursing professor at the University of Washington who teaches nursing students about how to care for the unhoused. And she herself was once homeless. So that was a real important piece to me. This poem is called Pain on a Scale, and it's on page 58 if you have your book with you. The other thing about this poem is that it's in sections, and the last section is a man who's dealing with diabetes, but I don't ever name it. The other thing about this title is that we all know, I think, if you've been to a doctor's, that they'll say, "Can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10?" And I'm here to tell you that I think pain is probably one of the most subjective experiences that any of us can have. And the pain scale for kids is FACES. And I have another poem, which I'm not going to read, about scaling pain for kids. But again, I think that there's a variety of ways for us to talk about pain. And this is one of the ways that I try to get at it, because it's not just physical pain, it's emotional and spiritual pain as well. So how are we rating pain? Who isn't sick of being Sisyphus, pushing the rock of yourself daily up from the bed? When someone says hypochondriac, all I can think is, give me a shot of adrenaline. Irradiate this burden. No pain, no need to gain. So many tried and failed treatments, I say, give it a name. Call it a filament spun into tourniquet, anomaly twisted to penalty, an infestation scaling my nerves. What about heartache? Multiple strains of arthritis, hers, her child's, the husband leaves. She's a power outage, a walking specter in the disco swirl of daylight. What bandage or antiseptic for her plight? Was there an expiration date for rupture? Pathologic or melancholic, her grieving, a trail of gauze. A man says, my pain and I are transient. He's seeking ground, a rock. The war still resides inside, amps up his sugared house, bloody lows and highs, twitchy brood of his eyes, a bilious babble, warbles like a bird of necrosis, winged psychosis. His fractured peace begs for measure. I think you can see in this poem that I'm also trying to bring in some of the medical language and terminology, trying to use alliteration and some rhyme to pull you through. And also those big words, those really Latinate words that are used so often in medical language. It's very, they can be unnerving. So then again, how do we make order out of disorder? Can loss and grief, how do we make order out of our loss and our grief? And who gets their voice heard? Some of my early writings about my journey with my daughter, I will read a couple. And here I try to incorporate again some facts and deal with the spiritual needs and images. And I have also interviewed others about, in this next poem, this is a sort of a compilation of many voices. So it's mine along with other people. And again, it's the house burning book, this time page 23. When my child fell ill. When my child fell ill, what didn't kill me left me drained as bleached coral, spongiform, a holy mess in unmapped reefs. What didn't kill me lassoed years from sleep, stole cabinets of dreams, chewed up the storylines where monsters never stray from closets or else disappear by morning. Other mothers fretted over pox and croup, buzzed about their soccer stars, piano prodigies. Well-wishers sent their remedies saying, leave it to God, and stayed away. What didn't kill put no substance on my frame, did not gift me a badge or crown, did not ennoble. Stripped and salted, I left God in her wheelhouse, wandered the overlit corridors of medicine, challenged their priests and litanies. You've prayed for the day when you'll turn to see your child still swollen with drugs, packing sand into buckets, surrounding herself with a castled home, and like Galileo with his telescope, finally finding the multiple moons of Jupiter, her illness reveals itself, one part of a larger constellation. Ursa Major, perhaps, well known to you, but not the brightest star. So again, I'm going to share this PowerPoint, I believe. Yes. Oh, and I'm going to go back to this poem. So this poem is again looking at diabetes and interviewing lots of different patients and caregivers and doctors at the Research Institute and beyond. And One of the things I learned in one of my first interviews was a mom said to me, I really hate this name. And so I said, well, what name would you give it? And so then I started asking all these other people, well, if you could rename your illness or your disease, what name would you give it? So this is called diabetes, and I will read it. The di as in diabolic, rooted in siphon, the slurp of syrup in the veins, a sludge sweet sewage, a drain. I say, call it a jellyfish with hidden stingers, a sucking sea anemone, a Judas kiss. My son calls it one step ahead fox, stealth bomber, keeping him off guard, omnivorous, always hungry. I say, call it a 4-square meal of vigilance. Call it a late night horror show whose theme prayer is, if I should die before I wake. I've read about the dead dogs and the children starved. So many experiments. One mother hates the dying sound of it, wants a word that stands up proud on a protest sign. Call it rosewater, a sugar baby lullaby. The sourness buried in mounds of test strips, phenol's tarry smell, and a bee-shot sting. All right, call it Tenacious D, mock rocker turned metal god, strutting up and down a honeyed tightrope, and call insulin the island queen of soul, blood sister, your rumba, salsa, tango partner, the one who lets you dip but not fall. I will say that many of these images came directly from the people that I interviewed, that almost every one of them. And the island queen of soul, by the way, if you don't know, the insulin is made in the islets of Langerhans in the body. So I sort of adapted that. And then for those of you who don't know about diabetes, you can have these great dips or you can have these huge falls. And one caregiver who was also a researcher who also lived with diabetes said that one of the things she always worried about was if she would die in her sleep. So that's how I have used those pieces. How are we doing here? In your packet also is this poem by a young teenager. Again, actually she was, I think, 18 when she wrote it, senior in high school, called Pancreas, the Dead Organ and Deadbeat Friend. I'll read it pretty quickly and then I think I'll read one more and then we'll do the open for Q&A and you'll have your last prompt. Pancreas, the dead organ and deadbeat friend. Don't look now, but that one friend of yours is coming. Yes, you know who I'm talking about. That one friend who surfs your couch, who tries you out, who drags you down, tires you out, who drags you down. They sit there, face shadowed out, dressed all in black, looking like going to a funeral is in their agenda for the day. They sit there, completely oblivious of the annoyance they cause, the pain they create, and the fact is that they show up at your house, your sanctuary, your temple of God, and sit down on your couch like they are the main focus of your life, controlling every action you make. The funny thing is, they are. You live life day in and day out trying, but as Newton proved, what goes up must come down. It's time to defy that law and make sure when you're up, you stay up. Don't let that friend take you down. If you feel yourself going down, go down kicking and screaming. Okay, I am just going to read you one more to end on a slightly happier note on page 30. So my daughter is now 23. She went into her final remission when she was 14. And when she was 18, she told me she was getting a tattoo. Of course, we had been talking about this for a while. And she wouldn't tell me what the tattoo was. So we had talked about making sure that she was in a, clean and safe and sterilized environment and the inks weren't toxic, et cetera, et cetera. But she went with a friend. And then she texted me a picture of the tattoo afterwards. And here's the poem I wrote about this. After remission, her first tattoo. It wasn't the needles or punctured skin, rat-a-tat-tat and repeat, that surprised me. She'd had years of infusions. It wasn't the ink, like an ant trail of dark blood, nothing we hadn't both seen in the vials siphoned monthly, like crude oil from shale that often sputtered or refused to flow. It was the location she chose, familiar bench of her left inner arm, exposed and soft as morning haze, where once tubes were tied above her bulbous vein. And the image in Roman numerals, their heft like those carved on a tombstone, engraved on a sundial or gold coin, a code one must decipher, something a future lover will rub his finger over or kiss. The tattoo inscribed today marks an expiration to the platoons of bottles, pills, lined up, dutiful as soldiers. Marks 4 years since the gnat swarm of her rash and weakness finally lay dormant like larvae in winter. And my gift is forgetting the phlebotomist's name that I once knew by heart. Before the Q&A, I want you to just go back. You can look at what you wrote, your lists. And now, after hearing all of this today, see if there's anything more you'd like to add to your list. And I've given you the rest of the prompt so that when you go away and you have a moment and you're dying to do something with your work, that you have these other options. But look at your list, see if there's anything more that you want to add to it. And I'd love to open the floor to questions. I think someone will have to either come up to the computer or...
Yeah. Can you hear me okay from here?
Yes.
So I'm thinking actually the sound is better from out here than from the computer behind the podium because that's behind the other microphone.
Okay.
So I think we can just have students shout out questions, and if you can't hear them, I can repeat them.
Great.
Questions? I'll start, but we need to hear your voices too. This is an event for you, definitely. Can you talk a little bit more about that research project and how you thought of the link between poetry, which is, art making, and research, and how you chose the research participants and what the ethics of using their voices is, and all the, I guess, how that project ended up coming into being.
Sure. I wrote a couple of grants. Believe it or not, I got them all. I was really shocked. I talked with that's how I got paid for it, but I had talked with this there's a Benaroya Research Institute, which does all this research on autoimmune disease, and they were very excited to try to incorporate art in some way into the work that they do to make it understandable to larger audiences. Autoimmune disease itself, there's many of them, probably about 80 of them that are known, and they're rising all the time. There's, I think, an epidemic of autoimmune disease, and we won't go into why that is, but lots of theories. And I talked a lot with the doctors, the head of the institute, and said, I had done some research already. I mean, I had worked with patients and caregivers before, and I asked permission to, we did a audio and video recording. They signed release forms, and we're actually very encouraging. Everybody was very encouraging to have their words, written down and put out there. And then the promise was that the book then would be given to all of the people at the end. They also contributed, there's a lot of art in this book. There's a lot of visual art that was done by people at the Institute, some of the patients, some of the caregivers themselves. So making it a collaborative experience between everybody involved. It wasn't just me and me writing the poems. It was people contributing to it in other ways as well. We, of course, asked permission of anyone that we talked to research people who were involved in a research project in the hospital as a patient and as a caregiver. They were very excited to have somebody come and talk to them, and believe it or not, and just, have their experience given voice. So I highly recommend that people, I spent a lot of time making sure that everybody was comfortable with whatever we were doing. And if they didn't want, I would show them the work ahead of time. And if they didn't want it published, it didn't get published. But they did sign release forms for both their work. And we had hoped to make a video of their words. We never got around to it because of money, but that's how life goes. And I also had a lot of access to the lab itself. So that was really fun. I got to go in and look at all the, look through microscopes and see how they were allocating samples into little pipettes and things like that. It was really illuminating to me. And also just hearing the doctors talk about disease and ways that they had to learn to use metaphor and image to help their patients understand what was going on, and the researchers too, because they have to give presentations, I think, for donors, of course, and of course to other medical professionals. But they were very willing to talk to me. One of them often used the term about the Hulk, and I tried to get the Hulk into one of the poems, but it was too was like, once you go to the Hulk, then you've taken people off into the Marvel world. So I didn't really want to do that. I didn't want to use that image. So again, those, images that you don't want to use because it distracts from sort of the impact of the work. I think you have to be careful about. Is that helpful?
It was, yes. And actually it reminds me that we have a summer undergraduate research program here, and a project like this I think would work incredibly well. And Jan Osborne is in the back saying thumbs up for her students. I think that was an offer of being a faculty mentor for a project. Yeah. Any questions about the poetry, about the packet?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the packet too, and why I chose other poems in there if you want me to. I can tell you that Diagnosis is a poem by Dr. David Watts. I chose this. It's from his book, Taking the History, because it's so concise. I love his language. I think it talks to an earlier time in history, but it's not completely gone. The doctors often think that they're they're the ones who stand in power, and they do to some extent. What's the diagnosis and how much are they going to tell you about what you have? So I think that that's in there. I put Poem to My Uterus by Lucille Clifton. I love this poem. I teach it a lot. If anyone doesn't know Lucille Clifton, definitely go find out, find her work. It's huge amount of work. And I love this because she compares her uterus to a sock, and all the way through, she has this extended metaphor. I put in The Body Mutinies by Lucia Perillo. She's no longer with us. She had MS. This is from her book, The Body Mutinies, and this is all about finding out her diagnosis and sort of her interaction with the doctor, and then her experience of trying to come to terms with it in those first few minutes and hours and seconds, how time shifts. I gave you Katie Ferris. She's pretty contemporary. A woman with amputated breasts awaits PET scan results from her new book, Standing in the Forest of Being Alive, all about having breast cancer. I gave you Talking to Grief by Denise Levertov because, again, I love this extended metaphor of a grief being like a homeless dog. The Good Doctors, because another parent caregiver experience of a child who may not ever be able to communicate with him and the grief around that. I gave you a couple more poems by my student writers as well. And I put sickle cell disease or asthma is another, believe it, autoimmune disease. And then another young woman living with a tumor. And last, but certainly not least, Having It Out with Melancholy, Jane Kenyon, writing about depression in all of its various and sundry iterations, using the names of her antidepressants, talking about when she has good days, bad days, how she feels like it has lived with her whole life. And from her book, Otherwise, Having It Out with Melancholy.
A book I would highly recommend.
Her book is Otherwise, yeah.
Well,
But yeah,
Anthony has a question.
Great.
Yeah. So like, oh, sorry. So like under the premise section, it kind of talks about how like caretaking can also involve a dissolution of parts of oneself. I'm kind of curious as to kind of what that process looks like, but like also if different parts of the self are kind of built in kind of substitution of those parts that are kind of dissolved, or just kind of what the identity of a caretaker, how that kind of adapts.
What was the last little piece? How can that what?
How the identity of a caretaker adapts.
Ah,
Self. Yeah.
great question. I think you learn to let go of a lot of fantasies that you've had as a parent or caregiver who maybe isn't a parent, but still maybe you're in a relationship with somebody and you think it's going to go one way and suddenly it is not going to go that way. And you've had all these images in your mind built up about how it could be. I think we all have fantasies about who we are going to be in our lives as a parent. Who are we going to be as a parent? Who our child is going to be? Where, how things are going to unfold. And getting a diagnosis of some sort can completely pull the rug out from that. And you have to grieve. You have to let go of those images and you have to build new ones. And grief doesn't happen just once. It isn't something that's one and done. And I put in one of those poems, is it melancholic or pathologic? Because even now, the mental health professionals are looking at long-term grieving as a possible diagnosis in and of itself, unresolved grieving. And I won't get into that and my feelings about that because I think everybody grieves differently over different periods of time. But it's a very real thing, and I think it needs to be addressed. And I think it's very hard for most of the medical profession to understand that, even for ourselves. I mean, even as a therapist myself, it took me a long time to understand what I needed, what I had to let go of, what was important. I mean, in some ways, that was the silver lining, was deciding what was really important in life and letting those other pieces go and trying to just see the person in front of me for who they were and who they are. And that's an ongoing challenge, by the way. It doesn't stop just because your child grows up. It's true for any parent, whether your child has an illness or not. And for other caregivers, let's say you're in a marriage or a relationship with somebody, you still have expectations that might change and your own capacities. Everybody talks about this new normal, but even the new normal shifts all the time. I think the hardest part, the truth of living is that change is the one thing that happens all the time. And that's regardless of whether you've got a sick person in your life or someone who's got a mental health issue or any kind of other challenge in life. That's what you have to learn to do, is learn to be flexible and acknowledge when you're having a hard time and you need help. I think that's another really big piece of it. And find support.
All right, thank you. I think we are actually running short on time and some of the students have to go off to their next class soon. Thank you very much. Let's give Suzanne a round of applause.
Thank you. I think in my packet, I also gave you my email and a website. Feel free to contact me with any other questions that come up.
I have to say that no other Tabula Poetica poet has ever given such an extensive packet, and we really appreciate that. It's like a little textbook that you can carry away with you. So thank you for curating all those poems and including the student work. I think that's great. Thank you so much. And we will see you back here at 4 p.m.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Anna, I have a question for you.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
If you want cookies, we got plenty of cookies left over here. Also, we can stick on the
Everyone bought it. I have it there, so I didn't bring it, but yes.
I know that big crowd.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah. I just thought I would have a
You are
little.
talking in front of everybody, though.
Oh.
It's, the sound is still connected to the screen. Do you want me to call you? Okay.